being inside in our house is actually a huge hazard in terms of the environmental exposure to these things. And this like blew me away when I realized that we're becoming like an indoor species. Like we spend 80% of our time indoors these days. And air pollution, we normally think about, oh, there's a busy road nearby, there's a lot of air pollution, but actually the air inside our homes can be worse than the air outside our homes. And it's going to be the accumulation of things like having your windows closed, the byproducts of cooking without good ventilation, certain consumer products. So a lot of the fragrances that are added to things, so maybe in laundry and personal care, those are things that we can also look at by just things like opening our windows more, getting outside as much as possible, choosing products inside our home that minimize some of these things that are known to be problematic. So some of the fragrances, the volatile organic compounds, or what's known as persistent organic pollutants. So these are kind of forever chemicals that hang around for a really long time. And then the phthalates, which is in everything from food packaging, fragrances, different personal care products. And often these accumulate in dust. So it's something that when I was researching the book, I was quite shocked to find that dust is not just kind of this unsightly thing that, you know, accumulates in our home when we haven't got around to cleaning, but it's actually a source of a lot of these environmental toxic chemicals. And so things like wet dusting your home is really, really important to do now and again.
Doctor's Kitchen. Recipes, health, lifestyle. So yeah, I'm just basically going to ask you a whole bunch of stuff about the book because, I'm using the book as a stand at the moment. It's under here, but it's propping up my mic at the moment. But I've read it and I've like taken a ton of notes from it and stuff. So I'm really excited to talk to you about everything to do with that, because you've already written an immunology book or a book on the immune system and how it forms and stuff. So I was like, well, you've pretty much written everything. Like, how much more is there to write? But I was really blown away by all the content there. I just think it's brilliant. And the way you've done a deep dive into some of the nutrients and the individual ingredients, it just makes it really tangible and accessible for the reader. So well done.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it was a challenge to make the book like standalone and not something that people would have to have necessarily read the first one, but they kind of, I wanted them to be also complementary. So if you have read the first one, it's complementing that. And I think the second's a little bit more practical. I feel like it was the book I needed to read. I don't know if you found that as writing books yourself. It's almost like sometimes I need a practical guide because my head is full of all the theory, but I'm not very good at always putting that into, tangible real life things in my day-to-day life. So I kind of wanted to write it with a lot of compassion for people who are also struggling with those healthy habits, because it's not easy, is it?
Yeah, no, exactly. I think having some like concrete, tangible tasks that you can sort of implement into your routine day by day, I think it's really good. But I think it's one of the reasons why people listen to this podcast and people follow me as well, is because there's that foundation of evidence base, and people love to get geeky and think about why as a motivating factor for how they can practically put that into their day to day. So, and you've intertwined that beautifully. It's really well written.
Thank you.
So why don't we talk about what shapes our immunity? I guess that's a really nice way to start in terms of the immune system in this discussion and framing all the other things that I really want to talk about.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start, especially given the last 2 years with COVID. It's like I've been in this field for a while and writing for the media for a while, and then suddenly it got very noisy with COVID, and I was like, oh, writing and talking about the immune system is very difficult suddenly. But I always want people to appreciate that the immune system is a sensing system. It's quite similar to our brain in that way, because and it works hand in hand with our brain to really sense what's going on in your environment, and it's looking for certain inputs which is going to shape its function, and then help it decide what's an appropriate way to respond. So I always like to think of it as being shaped by things we can control and things we can't control. So the things we can control are sort of the more obvious things, like what we're putting into our body. So that would be nutrition, the types of micronutrients, so the vitamins and minerals, the macronutrients, but also like the timing of meals, when we're eating, that sort of thing as well. And then movement. So that's a really important input for our immune system. So how we move our body in our day-to-day life. And then something that I'm really passionate about is things like muscle mass, how much muscle strength and mass we have as we age. Then things like, sleep, rest, our stress response, and other environmental exposures. So whereabouts you live, what your geographical location, that might determine how much sort of sunlight you get. It might determine how much pollution you're exposed to. So all of these kind of things are shaping the immune system. And it's not a static thing. We tend to think about our immune system, but the immune system we have today might look different to 5 years ago, when we maybe had a different lifestyle, lived somewhere else, had different kind of daily patterns to our behaviors. And then there's the other things that we can't control. So that would be, the certain genetic basis of how our immune system functions, and that's quite complicated to unpick. And then, other things that are less sort of tangible to change would be, there's links between things like socioeconomic status and how your immune system performs. So it's a really complicated system, and I would always caution people who see messages around the immune system that are very simplistic to just cast a critical eye, because nothing is ever that simple as I've discovered when it comes to this system.
Absolutely. You've beautifully described all the different things that shape your immune system in about 2 minutes, which is awesome. I want to drill down into some of the concepts, actually, particularly around COVID, because this concept of immunometabolism, I think it's a pertinent conversation to have. It's an uncomfortable one in lots of ways, because I think there's a lot of blame associated with weight and a misunderstanding of the drivers behind weight maintenance, weight loss, etc. We've discussed a lot of these different pathways on the podcast before, but I think through the lens of the immune system, it would be wonderful to talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, I think this is a field that's kind of emerged maybe in the last 5 years, this immunometabolism, and it really reflects something that we've known for a very, very long time, but haven't quite joined dots with. And that's, if you get a fever because you have an infection, so think of the last time you got flu, or maybe if someone's had COVID and felt quite unwell and you had a fever, your basal metabolic rate, your kind of resting metabolic rate, will rise maybe 10 to 15% during the time that you've got that fever. And that reflects the actions of the communication molecules from your immune cells acting on your brain, changing like your thermal regulation, changing your metabolism in order to provide the fuel for that immune response. So we know from just looking at what happens during infection that we've got this really direct communication between what the immune system's doing and your metabolism, because one is supporting the other. So your metabolism is fueling the immune cells. And then we also know that having inflammation, which is a response of your immune system, can also affect your metabolism. So there's this kind of bi-directional relationship. And we also know that when it comes to body weight, and this was something I wanted to really try and get across in the book, because I think we use body mass index as a kind of metric to determine someone's size, which is useful for certain, population studies to get a gauge. But as anyone will know, if they've ever had their BMI measured and maybe they're like an athlete or something, or they're a very tall, broad person, they might have a BMI that sits them in what we would call an at-risk weight category when they're actually quite healthy. it's more about your body composition. So what is your body made up of?
Mm.
And we know that fat and muscle are really immunologically active tissues. So they're full of different immune cell populations. And when our body composition gets skewed, so we end up with larger amounts of fat and maybe reducing amounts of muscle, then the immune cell populations that are living in those tissues are also skewed. And this can lead to this low-grade chronic inflammation, which I'm sure many people will have heard of as not a good thing. And it seems to be a proxy for pretty much every type of chronic disease that has been explored. So then when you have this low-grade inflammation, you're also changing your metabolism again to fuel that inflammatory response. So you get into this kind of vicious cycle.
Yeah. And in terms of BMI being a crude measure of weight and health that we're trying to move away from, but I guess the reason why it's so ubiquitous is because it's just so easy to do and very
Yeah.
accessible for a lot of people. Where would you say we should be moving towards when it comes to measuring body composition? I've heard a lot about DEXA scan. There's a bunch of other tools and things. In your eyes, do you think everyone should really know what their composition is, or as a way of knowing where they're moving in terms of the direction of health?
That's a really interesting question. And I think certainly as we get older, so we know that muscle mass is quite expensive tissue for our bodies to hold on to. So if we don't use our muscles, we're not going to retain them. And sarcopenia, which is this kind of age-related decline in muscle mass, happens as we get older. So from about our 30s, every decade, we're at higher risk of losing our muscle mass, which is kind of the anti-inflammatory component of our body composition. So I think certainly in your 40s and 50s, you might want to be thinking about building that muscle bank account and trying to offset the inevitable age-related reduction in muscle mass. And I think things like DEXA scan is a really good way to get that. Some people might be able to do that through their GP or through their local gym, or if they're working with a fitness professional, but it might not be something that's accessible to everyone. So there's different measurements that can sort of help us understand the sort of body composition, things like waist to hip ratio and waist to height ratio. So these are measurements you can just find online and plug in your different metrics, and it'll give you a range, and you can check to see where you sit in terms of what's sort of relatively healthy. But I just think that the more research that comes out in terms of chronic diseases that are linked to inflammation, the more that muscle mass, muscle function just is this thing that comes up again and again and again. And we know that working our muscles is producing certain immune messengers, so these communication molecules that are actually offsetting some of our inevitable age-related decline in immune function anyway. So it's really, really like the biggest anti-aging thing I can think of for people who want to age well. And we know that as we get older, our immune cells decline. Get your muscles moving. It's in most physical activity guidelines that we should be doing at least 2 resistance-based sessions per week, so putting resistance on your muscles. But I feel like that really plays second fiddle to the cardio. So we all know that we should be getting our heart rate up, we should be aiming for a certain number of steps, or doing some of that physical activity that involves jumping around, sweating, getting your heart rate elevated. But we don't often think about the resistance element. So
yeah, I'm a big fan of the potential for DEXA as a motivating factor. So every year after a certain age, you're invited for particular types of screening, whether it be colon cancer screening, whether it be breast cancer screening. I reckon there could be a screening whereby you're given the muscle to fat ratios and you're told, look, this is how you can improve it. And it's almost like giving people a target to achieve through things like strength training exercises, so you can readdress that balance. Because you're right, sarcopenia is a huge issue. And I mean, the data looking at that loss of muscle mass and the propensity towards all those other lifestyle related illnesses, whether it be cardiovascular disease, diabetes, dementia, there's so much that exercise has a role in, and that's all mediated by the immune system and inflammation.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea with the DEXA. So instead of people getting on the scales and feeling disappointed because it's not moving in the right direction, it may be that you've got dramatic changes to your body composition going on that are moving in a positive way, but sadly that's not picked up at when you just look at your weight. And that would be really interesting to have that from a certain age, just as a kind of screening tool.
Yeah, diving a little bit deeper into some of those mechanisms, you mentioned mitochondrial damage. And I wonder if we could just zoom in a little on mitochondria as it pertains to the immune system, and why mitochondrial damage is such an important concept to get people's heads around. And you described this really nicely in your books, and that's why I'm pulling it out.
Yeah, I think the mitochondria are fascinating. I think the immune system is sort of your immune cells, they have mitochondria, as all your nucleated cells do, and these are really at the core of all the metabolic processes. So they're little tiny organelles found in our cells, and they basically help us turn food into energy, generating something called ATP, which is like the energy currency of our body. And obviously when our immune cells are activated and fighting off germs, they need this extra supply of energy. So the mitochondria and the health of those little organelles is really important to immune cell function. And so during a sort of, at the moment, I'm healthy, I don't have any infections, nothing going on. I would expect my mitochondria to just be working away at their baseline level. But then if I got sick, for example, the mitochondria would have to do some sort of metabolic switching to be allowing my immune cells to become activated. So there's these metabolic switches that take them from this quiescent state, we call it, into a metabolically active immune cell that can go out and fight infections. So we need the mitochondria to be functioning properly so that we can do that effectively if we were to encounter a virus, for example. And the other interesting thing about mitochondria is that they can be damaged by things like oxidative stress. So we encounter oxidative stress in our bodies just from the day-to-day running of, of our bodies turning food into energy. But also when we're fighting an infection, for example, and we have all this inflammation in our body, which is there to fight off those germs, make the environment really uncomfortable for those germs, the immune system uses oxidative stress as a weapon to fight off the germs. And because it's uncomfortable for the germs, it's also having a collateral effect on our bodies. So there's always this kind of two sides to every immune response. It's helpful, it's beneficial, but there's always the opportunity for a bit of collateral damage to our own tissues. And so this oxidative stress that's elevated during inflammation can also damage the mitochondria themselves and make them a bit kind of leaky, a bit kind of dysfunctional. And that's okay if we have sufficient antioxidant status in our body. But certain lifestyle factors like smoking, stress, poor sleep, pollution, a poor diet, aging, for example, can actually cause a decline in our mitochondrial function, and also the sort of number of mitochondria that our cells have. And when the mitochondria are damaged, they actually release what we call damage-associated molecular patterns. So like little barcodes that leak out, and these further activate our immune cells because our immune cells have receptors for these damage-associated molecular patterns. And it tells us that there's tissue damage in the body. We need inflammation and immune cell activation to go and repair that damage, which is fine if you've, broken your arm and there's tissue damage. But if it's just because things are just metabolically a little bit falling apart, then you're actually getting yourself into this perpetual cycle, and we get this sort of low grade inflammation that's furthering that oxidative stress.
That really nicely sort of describes a cascade of different steps, I guess, in the immune response. So you have your mitochondrial damage that leads to these other molecular patterns and stuff. And just from the lens of evolution, which is what I always like to think about, are there certain behaviors that would be protective as a result of that massive swath of inflammation? So, you know, you're going to be energy drained, depleted. You're not going to really want to go outside. You're going to want to sort of hibernate. Are there
Yeah.
some sort of benefits associated with that behavior? Because it seems that there's almost like a badge of honor if you can break through that and like continue to go to work, continue to exercise, continue to look after the kids, like all that kind of stuff. Should we be listening to our bodies a bit more and being a lot more intuitive?
Oh, 100%. And I was kind of at the beginning of COVID, I was thinking hopefully the legacy of COVID is that we get over this presenteeism where we feel like we have to go and show up to work. It's just a cold, I'm fine, you know. And it turns out that the science tells us that generally when we go to work, even if we have some minor infection, you know, like a cold, we're generally less productive, and we're generally spreading that infection to our fellow commuters and people around us, and we're taking longer to get well again. So I'm really hopeful that people will start to listen to their bodies, but also the workplace culture will be like, okay, you're sick, take one day off at home, get fully restored, and then come back to work rather than trying to fight through it. And, you know, when we have this inflammation going on in our body, it's serving a purpose. It's trying to fight off those germs. As I said, it's making this hostile environment for them inside our body. And it's also acting on our brain. So some of the mediators of this inflammatory response produced by our immune cells are acting on our brain to change our behavior, which is why when you have inflammation in the body, you probably feel a bit socially withdrawn. You probably feel a bit, you know, depressed, and change in appetite, change in mood, change in sleep patterns, lethargic, tired. You might have a fever. We call these sickness behaviors. So they're a suite of different behaviors that are induced by our immune system acting on our brain. And that serves a purpose because you don't feel like going out and doing your normal activities. You might just feel like lounging around on the sofa, relaxing. So you're helping your body have the energy available to get well again, because as I mentioned earlier, you know, immune responses are very energetically costly. So you're freeing up that energy because you're not going out, running around, going to the gym, going to work, and you're also not spreading your germs to other people, because nobody really wants to have someone else's germs either. Now, the thing that gets quite interesting when we start to look at chronic inflammatory diseases where there's not an infectious disease component, but people have this low-grade inflammation, so we start to see these symptoms happening. So people with mood disorders, there seems to be a subset of people for whom that inflammation in the body is causing the low mood. And there's been several clinical trials looking at either an anti-inflammatory lifestyle intervention like a diet, or using anti-inflammatory drugs can actually improve the mood disorder in those people. For a long time, people with things like autoimmune diseases, it was considered that they had a low mood because they'd been diagnosed with this chronic disease. But actually, it turns right out that that mood can be improved by certain anti-inflammatory interventions, because it's the inflammation in their body from the autoimmune disease that was acting on their brain. So I think it's really interesting, and I'm really hopeful that this will open up many therapeutic avenues in the future in this field.
I totally understand that. Not to go on too much about COVID, because I think everyone's pretty done with it. But I did find it interesting how, at least with the initial variations of it, that it was a virus that allowed people to sort of function normally for the first couple of days whilst they were infectious, until they started displaying symptoms and those sickness behaviors, and then they stayed at home. So it was pretty efficient at getting out there undetected, wasn't it, at the start? I mean, that's probably one of the reasons why it just spread so quickly.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, every infectious disease will have its own kind of period of where it's infecting us before that immune response kicks in. And obviously, when we think about how we've evolved in this world full of germs, The whole reason we have an immune system is because we have germs in our environment where we've been evolving as a species. And so the germs are always trying to evade our immune response, and our immune response is always trying to get on top of these different, oh, I'm not well, I'm going to stay home. Easy spread globally.
Yeah. I've got to ask you about sugar, because we just recently did a podcast all about the impact of sugar and ways in which to blunt the speed at which sugar goes into your bloodstream. And I was really interested to read about a section in your book about how sugar causes inflammation, its association with, well, the cause of advanced glycemic end products, insulin resistance, and its association with the immune system. I wonder if we could touch on the impact of excess sugar in the diet.
Yeah, this is a hot topic, and it's again one of those messages that's quite simplified when we, look at online media. It's sugar is bad, sugar is inflammatory. It's definitely the sort of nutritional demon du jour. But I think there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. And I think one thing that stood out actually in the last 2 years, I think it was 2021, there was a study looking at elevated blood sugar as one of the most likely risk factors to explain why an otherwise healthy patient with no other risk factors would end up with severe form of COVID. So say you're just, you're healthy, you're not of a certain age, no underlying conditions, but you have a poor blood sugar control. And we do know that it's not necessarily the sugar that you're eating. So, if I'm sitting with some sugary snack right now, I couldn't say, okay, that's going to weaken my immunity, because you have to zoom out and broaden the lens and say, what else have I eaten today across the week lifestyle? But when we eat sugar, or sugar bowl, eating sugar, but when we eat sugary foods, it's going to be absorbed and have an impact on the sugar in our blood. And sugar in our blood is something that our body doesn't want to happen for very long. So we produce, because if it's hanging around there for too long, it's going to be problematic, not just for our immune system, but for lots of other problems in our body. And we know that studies, for example, with people with poorly controlled diabetes, where they have prolonged elevated blood sugar, we see weakened antimicrobial defenses, so the immune response to microbes, viruses, bacteria. And in some cases, this environment can provide sort of fertile ground to promote viral replication, and it can sort of promote this storm of inflammation. And if we think about the immunometabolism that we talked about before, then we know that the metabolic sources of fuel going into the body are going to affect how that inflammation is proceeding. So I would say to people, rather than worrying about how much sugar you're eating, think about your blood sugar response, because I think that everybody is different in how this happens. So we'll get a blood sugar rise after each time we eat, more or less, and it's primarily down to the carbohydrate content of the food, but also what else we're eating in the context of that meal. And then a sort of healthy blood sugar response after eating should sort of normalize in a sort of timely way in the hours after that meal or snack. But as many of us might have experienced, you can get on that blood sugar roller coaster, which is, where you might get a sort of sugar spike followed by a slump, and it sort of doesn't quite stabilize in the way that we would like. And we know that this can be associated with an exaggerated inflammatory response. Sort of 3 to 4 hours after eating, we have a mild inflammatory response that occurs anyway, and the more sugar that is in that meal, the more exaggerated this seems. During that, system seems to be less able to deal with germs. We know that if we have sugar hanging around in the blood for too long, sugar molecules on different proteins in our body, and our immune system seems to be particularly susceptible to this. So it will glycinate things like antibodies, and then our antibodies don't function as well. And then insulin is the hormone that helps remove sugar from the blood. And insulin seems to really mess with the function of immune cells when it's dysregulated. And it can also add to this oxidative stress. And then blood sugar issues seem to affect how well we switch on and off genes. So a certain number of genes in our body, but each cell will be switching on and off different doing and what it needs. Blood sugar response can also affect that process, which can perhaps build into more long-term issues. So there's sort of multiple ways that the sugar in our diet can affect our, most public health messaging is suggestive that we should reduce foods that have lots of added sugar. So, we have things like the sugar tax, sugar sweetened beverages. I don't think that, you need to get yourself into that sort of food prison where you cannot eat any sugar ever, but we do need to be mindful. And certainly as a parent, I realize that the environment is just for kids, it's just like everything's trying to make your child eat added sugar at every point. So we need to also accept that part of the responsibility is in the food environment that which we live. Like for me personally, I try to curate my own microenvironment at home, and I just don't buy the stuff that I don't want my family to eat. But inevitably, when you go outside into the big world, I'm not going to stop them at a birthday party, going wild at the, the buffet and that kind of thing. So I think, it's being conscious of the quality and the quantity of those foods that can set us off on that blood sugar roller coaster. So it's going to be the real obvious, foods that are full of added sugar and the sugar sweetened beverages. And then there's other strategies that can help, which is things like the fiber in your food. And fiber is probably, the unsung hero of the immune response. I'm sure we can discuss that in more detail later, but it can help with that blood sugar response. And then having protein with your meals and healthy sources of fat. I love just going and doing some movement after eating. So I'm not suggesting we go and exercise, but even if I'm in the house, I'm clearing up dinner or moving around the house, doing some housework, or just a light walk is really useful, because your muscles are a sink for glucose. They're going to suck it up, and in fact, you need in those situations. I think eating late in the day is also a bit more problematic for most people in terms of that blood sugar response.
Yeah, absolutely. I was regaling a story about my CGM. So I want to ask you about CGMs, because I've been using a CGM for the past couple of months, like a couple of weeks at a time. And I got some really interesting insights from my personal blood sugar response to certain items that I would buy in the supermarket, that I would read the back of the packets, like, it's got oats, it's got fiber, etc. But still my blood sugar would rise massively. And so that's really made me change sort of the kind of foods that I have in my diet. I wonder your opinion, perhaps generally on CGMs, and whether you think they're potentially useful.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. As somebody who loves data and loves a bit of self-experimentation, like, I'm really curious. I actually have an experiment coming up where I will be wearing one.
Oh, nice.
So I'm kind of interested to see the like what you experienced, how foods that I maybe routinely eat, how they're affecting my blood sugar. I'm not sure, outside of curiosity, if they have a place for really optimizing your health, because I feel like there's a few things that are missed. It's only looking at the blood sugar response. It's not also looking at your insulin response. And I feel like we're looking to get this sort of flat line glucose, but I don't think that's necessarily where we need to be. I think having a rise in blood sugar is fine and normal. And I think in a healthy person, as long as you have the ability to correct that in a timely fashion, I think that's also okay. But the blood sugar monitor won't tell you what your insulin's doing. So it won't tell you how much insulin is needed by your body to keep your blood sugar levels at a healthy number. And so you're missing that kind of half of the equation. Perhaps there's going to be some future devices that are going to give you both sets of information. So what your blood sugar is doing and how much insulin your body's having to produce to normalize your blood sugar levels. I really like the is it the PREDICT studies with Tim Spector, which came out maybe 2021 now, where they looked at huge numbers of people with continuous glucose monitors, and they found that people respond dramatically differently to the same food. And this was something that I wrote about in the book, because I had seen things on social media where people like, don't eat these 5 foods because of what they do to your blood sugar, and it'd be things like porridge, or not just the obvious things like sugary foods. And I was kind of like, well, you know what, we're all really different. And they in the paper, they attribute it to partially to genetics, but the biggest part seemed to be the gut microbiome. So that seemed to be what was in this study in particular, giving that huge difference between 2 people and perhaps the same food. So I think that, again, that intuition of how do you feel after eating can be a real important factor. And I do think it's perhaps good practice to do the kind of things like adding protein to meals, some healthy fats to meals, being generally active throughout your day, and the other things that we know will regulate that blood sugar response. I think it's really interesting, though. I would love to know how I'm reacting to foods that I eat all the time. What were the biggest surprises then for you?
So energy balls, I don't really have energy balls regularly because I don't have much of a sweet tooth in that respect, but I thought I would try it just to see, like, what the response is. And it was not good. It was
what
not
about
good
coffee?
Coffee doesn't have anything, no, because I tend to so I start my day at like 5 in the morning. I'll like meditate, I'll do a bit of stretching, and then I'll have a coffee at about 6:30 in the morning. So I've waited a little time after that natural diurnal cortisol spike to have my coffee. Didn't do anything, but then again, I don't know what my insulin response is. So my insulin could have been being produced to maintain that flat level of glucose, which, just for the listeners, is a very interesting concept to get your head around, because you can have a flat level of glucose, or your HbA1c can be within normal range, and all of a sudden go out of range because you've needed increasing amounts of insulin, because you become generally more and more resistant to it, and the tolerance effects dictates that you need to release more, and to the point where it reaches that critical threshold where your insulin is just not enough, and then that's when we have to use diabetic drugs and all the rest of it. So I don't have that kind of information, but I think you're right, having a collection of all these different data sources, your microbiota data, your genomic data, your glucose response data, perhaps even other wearables as well, to really drill down on, okay, what kind of things should you, what are personal insights for you? For people like me and you, I think this is really cool. But for the general population, I'm still a little bit skeptical as to how much of a difference this is going to make to someone who just can't muster the motivation to cook from scratch at home a couple of times a week. I don't think it's going to move the needle for that person, which unfortunately is a lot of us.
Yeah, and especially, if you're saying to someone who maybe doesn't have the level of awareness of health, or even an interest in their personal health and changing sort of their lifestyle habits, let's wear this continuous glucose monitor, and let's see, when you have your normal daily food and drink intake, and you're having like a can of Coke and something really sweet for lunch, or lacking fiber, and the person sees this kind of blood sugar roller coaster and then gets that afternoon slump, and you say to them, okay, if this continues, it's maybe going to send you down a path towards increased risk for certain conditions, but that you might not get those symptoms for 10, 20 years. Is that enough for them to change that sort of routine habit? They might really enjoy that for lunch, and they don't have this sort of motivation to change. So it's an interesting one. and these things are becoming more and more available to the general public.
Yeah.
It's interesting what you said about cortisol, which is the stress hormone that's produced. We produce it naturally to wake us up in the morning. And this cortisol awakening response has quite a profound impact on our immune system. It actually helps get rid of immune cells that are a bit malfunctioning. So if you wake up in the morning and you feel quite like perky and you're ready to leap out of your bed and start the day, that's a good sign that your cortisol awakening response is sort of working properly, because that surge is getting you going, and it does that by pulling glucose into your bloodstream, so you've got a source of energy, even though you haven't eaten anything. It's taking it from the stored glucose in your body. And coffee also tends to have this effect on people. It'll increase cortisol, which pulls glucose from the stores in your body into the bloodstream, giving you immediate sense of energy. So is it the cortisol awakening response waking you up, or is it that first cup of coffee as soon as you open your eyes? But like you mentioned, delaying the first cup of coffee can allow you to still enjoy that morning coffee, but help you ascertain how do you really feel when you wake up. And that can be a good indicator of what's going on.
That's a really good tip. Yeah. And I think it might have been something that you said on a social media post or somewhere. I've heard it before. I was like, I definitely need to space out my coffee from the morning routine of waking up and having a coffee. I don't think I've ever been someone who's craved a coffee first thing in the morning. And I've just had that natural sort of, and it's going to sound really annoying to a lot of people listening to this, but I'm a naturally quite perky person in the morning.
I can understand that, as I'm definitely like on the extreme end of morning lark, but I'm married to someone who's a complete night owl. So I experience both ends of the spectrum.
Well, one of my buddies actually, who's a helicopter doctor in Sydney, he's a night owl, and his partner, who's a nurse, is a proper morning lark. So I understand the sort of the stresses that can create. Actually, speaking of people who are perhaps less motivated to make those changes, a lot of people move to supplementation as a sort of safety belt, if you like, just to make sure that they're functioning well. Pop a multivitamin. What are your thoughts on supplements and over supplementing? Because like you say, we're seeing a lot of supplements in the consumer space that are promising a lot of things, and sometimes I just wonder what the impact of over supplementation might be for people.
I think that's a really, really good point. I think the supplement space is really exciting. I'm always sort of looking to see what's coming out, doing the due diligence on, different formulations, different ingredients. I'm quite excited by the use of different botanicals in supplement form. But one of the things when I was writing the book, it came from a place of like, I'm asked all the time, what do I do when I get sick? Like, oh no, I've come down with this lurgy. What do I take? What supplements can I take? It's the go-to that people think about. Is there something that can shorten the duration of the illness, the symptoms? And my first thought is always like, what's your baseline? What's your baseline? What were you doing up until this point you felt sick? And so the middle section of the book is about building your baseline. So it's looking at the different lifestyle levers that we can tangibly grab onto and just turning them up a notch or two. So your diet, your blood sugar response, the exercise, sleep, all of those things. Because once you have your baseline, then you can think about what aspects of my baseline do I need to supplement? And then when I get sick, I know I've got a good baseline, but are there little things I can add in once I become sick that might get me better sooner? And so I like to think of it as from that perspective. So before you go spending your money on things, build your baseline, and then also have your little kind of medicine cabinet of supplements for when you do get sick, because there's maybe things that you don't need to take all the time necessarily. So the supplements space is really interesting. I think we don't really have a good way of knowing who's deficient in what micronutrients, so the vitamins and minerals. With the immune system, the ones that spring to mind is also always things like vitamin C, vitamin D, zinc. But I would argue that you need to be sufficient in all key micronutrients, so all of the essential vitamins and minerals, because they all play a role in how your immune system functions. So we're looking for that sufficiency across the whole suite of the essential vitamins and minerals. And then if you maybe have an underlying health condition, or you're going through a particular period of stress or poor diet, you might be a new parent who's not getting enough sleep, not eating well, you might be pregnant, you might have a chronic inflammatory disease, your nutrient needs might be different, and then you want to supplement. You might exclude certain food groups for a whole plethora of reasons, so then you want to supplement your baseline with that. For me, I think perhaps once you worked on those baselines, the next thing is maybe sort of around gut health. I think supplementation around gut health might be something that's quite useful for a lot of people, and not necessarily probiotics, although I think they do have their place, but more sort of moving upstream to the prebiotics. So most of us are not eating enough fiber. Sometimes it can be quite hard with the current lifestyle and food environment that we have to get enough fiber. And there's some really interesting studies, actually they're quite old now, probably 15 years old, where 8 weeks of supplementing people with certain prebiotics, so galacto-oligosaccharide or fructo-oligosaccharide, so often you'll see it written as GOS or FOS, improved markers of immune cell function, so the ability of particular immune cells to kill viruses or respond to infection, also lowered levels of inflammation in the body, and better responses to vaccines have all been demonstrated from as little as 8 weeks of just taking a fiber supplement. So I think depending on how people are eating, or if suddenly adding more fiber to your diet is something that you're struggling with, then there might be a space for targeted intervention there. And I think it's going to help the immune system in 2 ways. So we know that it's feeding the microbes in the gut. They are producing their metabolites, which are absorbed into the bloodstream and traveling around the body and having direct impact on immune cell function. But it's also going to keep that gut barrier integrity in place. So we have this long digestive tube that is our digestive tract, and we're throwing all sorts of things in there every day, and it's got to cope with that, but it's also incredibly thin and delicate so that it can absorb the nutrients from our diet. And it's got this huge amount of microbial material in there, all of these sort of so-called good microbes that make up the gut microbiota. And if that barrier is compromised, those good microbes can sort of move into the body through the gut barrier, and there they become a problem because they look like any other germ to our immune system, and they will cause inflammation. So the gut can actually be quite a significant source of this unwanted inflammation in the body if we're not taking care of it. And these gut microbes are also sort of training and educating our immune cells, of which there are, a huge amount of them in the gut.
Yeah. And with regards to multivitamins, I just want to get your answer on this. Do you think they are a safety belt? Let's say, I don't know, like you pointed out, it's very hard to know what your baseline is in terms of your micronutrients and your minerals, your vitamins, etc. Do you think supplementing with a multivitamin is just a nice sort of foundation or a safety belt that people could utilize, or does it really have to be personalized to that individual?
I think in an ideal world it would be personalized. My worry is that people take a multivitamin and they think it negates the need for a good diet.
Yeah.
So it's okay, I've taken my multivitamin today, so if I go out and don't try and meet my nutritional needs through the meals that I consume, then it's all okay. And I think it depends on how balanced the multivitamin is as well, because we don't want to have too many of certain micronutrients. In fact, there are studies showing that that can be detrimental to immune cell function. So some is good, more is not always better. And it's kind of the poisons in the dose, really. So I think it may be, if you look at a population level, yes, it might be useful, because I suspect that many of us are burning the candle at both ends a little bit, pushing, ourselves to sort of the limits in terms of giving our bodies what it needs. So it could just be that that little safety net. Plus, when we get sick, we deplete a lot of these micronutrients anyway. And so part of the reason that I think some people take longer to recover from illness is because these stores are so depleted, and we really need to sort of build ourselves back up.
Yeah. And this is great, because I'm just going to ask you loads of questions and get your opinions on things. So, so what do you make of the influx of dehydrated whole food products? Like, so athletic greens, for example, as an example, is it, really, really popular? I think they're worth about $150 million. They have great distribution across the world, and they have a very good story. There are many other sort of versions of this product that are available in the market. I, for one, actually started taking a dehydrated green product like 10 years ago when I was living in Brighton. I just found one. I was trying to be healthy. I had no idea what I was doing. And I took that for many years. Not that I could, discern a describable difference or anything like that, but they are out there, and they are popular. I wonder what your opinion on those are.
Again, I would lean towards sort of food first, and use those as a kind of supplement to the gaps. Maybe you're a shift worker, or you're busy, or certain phases of your life where you're just not able to go with the food first approach. I think, again, it depends how they're formulated. I don't know if we have any studies looking at these sort of products in terms of their fiber and their effect on the microbiome. That would be kind of something I would be curious to know about. So yeah, if you take that instead of a meal, it's maybe giving you this sort of complete range of nutrients, but would it be better to have those nutrients through a meal because of the interaction with your gut microbiome? I'm not sure of the answer to that. Personally, I'm like, I don't want to drink my meal. I've never had like a protein shake or anything, because I just can't. I don't know. So it could be down to personal preference as well. I don't think you need to have it to be healthy if you've got the diet dialed in. But I could see how it could be really useful. If you imagine if you're working in the hospital and you're on a long shift, and you want to consume something that's not from the vending machine.
Yeah. I wonder about this. I mean, I don't think we're ever going to see a study that's done properly, because the market is already there. So there's no real need for a really robust study. That would look like, you have some participants where you give them a food focused approach, where you give them the general amounts that you would find in a concentrated supplement. You give other people a regular diet, let's say, quote unquote, with this supplementation that's equivalent to the amount of food that you have in the actual real food participants. And then you give someone a multivitamin in another sort of arm of the trial, and then just see if there's that graded effect, and maybe even like a supplement to the healthy diet one as well, and just see if that has any added benefit. Because I'm like you, I'm more of a food focused approach, food first approach, but I wonder if there are any attributable benefits to having that as an extra. Because I mean, there are some studies looking at broccoli sprout extract and some other, cruciferous vegetables as well, that are taking in supplemental form, that are promising.
I think these are the things that I'm quite excited about, is not like perhaps a meal replacement, but the supplements that are concentrating a specific botanical and looking at the effects in a population. And I think there's some really exciting data you can find looking at the mechanisms in cell culture studies in mice. But I think, we want to know who's going to benefit most from these kind of supplements to a good diet and lifestyle.
Yeah, let's talk about some of those botanicals that you're excited about, because you mentioned some in your book, like oregano. Listen to me, I've listened to way too many Americans podcasts. Oregano oil, obviously the big characters like garlic and turmeric, for example, honey. I'd love to know a bit more about that, and also sort of your process behind how you look at studies. I'm always fascinated in how people write books like yourself and go through that whole research process, because I have my way of doing things and doing that in my own books and stuff. And after doing my master's in nutritional medicine, you know, I was taught a different way of analyzing papers and stuff. So I'd love to know a bit more about that as well.
Yeah, oh gosh, the writing process. I feel like I buried that because it's this particular book I think was challenging because of lockdowns and homeschooling and all of this sort. Then I was doing all the editing when life sort of went back to normal and back, you know, working in person again. And yeah, I feel like I look at a few different things. So I'm looking for studies that are looking at the baseline of your immune system. So what does a healthy baseline look like? And then studies that are interventions in specific health conditions. And then in the last section of the book, I have a section on infection, on allergy, on autoimmune disease, and sort of what's in the literature around interventions that we can do in those particular situations. Generally trying to look at human studies. Yeah. You kind of often have to go with the evidence that's available and then caveat, you know, I'll sometimes make little boxes in the book that, you know, this interesting study in a mouse showed us this. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are a mouse and should take this, because it might not have the same effect. And then there's, when you look at something like a meta-analysis, which is grouping together lots of similar studies, and it's building that body of evidence, so you can say with a little bit more conviction that, okay, this is something that people should try. And quite often I would again caveat in the book that we're all really, really different, because even things like probiotic interventions,
absolutely,
when we look at specific strains, it's like, yes, the most of the people in the study reacted in this way, but that's not to say that you as an individual will also react in that way. So I also kind of encourage a little bit of self-experimentation within a safe kind of framework. So things like making a food diary or a symptom diary. And I know it's a real painstaking process to note these things down every day, but especially if you're trying out supplements and things, what are you looking for? What benefit or change are you curious about? And then taking something for a set amount of time and not changing too many other variables, not taking 10 different new supplements at once, and sort of going through that process really methodically can actually be of great value. I speak to people a lot who have changed a million things at once and they don't know what's working and what's not. And then you have to go unravel all that and start from scratch and do the hard work again.
Yeah, is it, you got this really lovely term at the start of the book. I think it was called the immunobiography, which I think is a lovely way of giving people a framework such that they can do that safe experimentation and they can do it in a methodical way. I thought it was really nice.
Because, you know, when you come with a question, I'll be like, well, okay, what age are you? How has your lifestyle been? What happened when you were a child? You know, where were you born? How were you born? How many courses of antibiotics have you had? What's in your family history? And then it's really, really illuminating once we start to go through the biography of your health and write it down. And I've listed some questions and different prompts for people, and it's kind of like a form of narrative medicine, telling your own story. And I found many people respond really well with that, because often when you have unpleasant symptoms or you have a diagnosis and you're coping with that, it can be quite helpful in accepting what's got you there when you start to look back and sort of scrutinize different parts of your life, and realize that our immune system is a product of everything that's gone before. As I said, it's not static, it's changing throughout our lifetime. It's sort of built by our exposures, both to infections, but also to other events in our life, from stress and our environment and our relationships, social connection, the list goes on, really. Yeah, so I guess going back to the different things that I'm excited about, I think things like garlic is really, it's a great thing to cook with. Everyone,
I'm so glad you said that. I bloody love garlic.
I know it's maybe for some people they're not a fan, but it's got a really growing body of evidence showing that some of the chemical compounds inside, so allicin is one that's been proven to have antimicrobial activity, and it shows real promise in treating and preventing upper respiratory viruses. So eating garlic can actually activate certain genes related to immune function. And I think that raw garlic, when you crush it and leave it and let some of those chemical reactions occur that will naturally form these compounds, it is the most effective way to consume it, but who wants to be doing that every day? And it's estimated that you need 3 times as much cooked garlic, so just throw as much into your food as you can.
I'm just thinking about a recipe now. So if I was to blend garlic in like a little food processor and then cover it with a good quality oil and leave it to steep for 24 hours before I used it, almost like a dressing, would that fix some of those phytochemicals that are found in garlic, or do they naturally degrade if they're exposed to air and then you lose some of those benefits?
That's a good question. I know that the crushing, the chopping is causing that reaction to start happening straight away. I don't know when it stops and when it would start to degrade. But yeah, maybe like a pesto or something.
Yeah.
I'm sure you would still have some of those beneficial compounds around.
Yeah, for
but
sure.
that's a
If you
good
made a
thing
fresh
to
pesto. Yeah, I'll look into
up.
that.
Yeah. Or salsa or hummus.
Yeah.
Salad dressings. I think turmeric is another one where there's been a lot of scientific interest, and it's full of these curcuminoids, which have been shown to have this antiviral and antibacterial activity. It's also really delicious and it gives that vibrancy to food. Pairing it with the black pepper is helping with the absorption, or taking as a supplement. And the same goes with garlic. There are supplements available if people really don't like the flavor of garlic. I don't know who those people are, but
I don't know any.
Do they exist? And again, curcumin, 500 milligrams a day has been shown to reduce pain and inflammation. And again, I think just the formulation is really important in terms of the bioavailability and the absorption. And then we have what we call quorum sensor inhibitors. So I think that sounds really like scientific, but quorum sensing is a way that germs sort of talk to each other using chemical messengers, and it helps them try to establish a critical threshold. So they need to obviously invade a host, so a human, and then they start to multiply to a critical threshold in order for that infection to really take hold and be able to spread to other hosts, so nearby humans. And a lot of these warming spices, so ginger, cardamom, eucalyptus, clove, they've been shown to interfere with this process, so they can be really useful. We often think of them as winter spices. So in winter we have a higher number of viruses that circulate because they tend to like the cooler conditions of winter. So having these warming spices habitually in your daily and weekly meals can help intervene with that process, stopping this quorum sensing process, so getting there before the germs are really able to take a foothold.
Amazing.
Another thing I'm a big fan of is lactoferrin. So that's something we produce naturally. It's in things like breast milk, it's in saliva, lots of body secretions. And there's also another one, lactoperoxidase, which is another product that we produce naturally. But there's now supplements available of this. And taking lactoferrin upon onset of cold symptoms has been shown to reduce the symptoms and shorten the duration. And also there's some evidence that it might actually prevent incidents of cold. So often it's taken as like a lozenge, so it coats the back of the throat and the mouth.
Where is lactoperoxidase? Where does it come from?
It's just an enzyme that our body produces naturally.
Oh, just naturally. Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, and then it can be, people have now started to make supplements of that. So,
and what's then I guess dose? Like what? How much should I be looking to get on that?
Lactoperoxidase, I don't know. I think with lactoferrin, it was around, there's studies between 600 milligrams and 2 grams per day. I personally, it's one that I keep in my little medicine box, and I have supplements that also have vitamin C and zinc combined together. And so as soon as any of us get any kind of lurgy, they're great for kids because obviously as a lozenge they can suck, and zinc and vitamin C are 2 micronutrients that our immune cells use way more of when they're actively fighting an infection. So I don't necessarily think people need to supplement with them all the time if they have a good balanced diet. But it's definitely something that I personally would take if I got sick, because there's some evidence it might shorten the duration of your infection. And then the beta-glucans from mushrooms. So I'm a big fan of these myconutrients, as I call them. So mushrooms, I think, have been long studied for sort of immune enhancing properties. And I think beta-glucans are a great one to supplement with during periods where you might be more stressed or have higher infection risk, or at the first sign of sort of a cold. And they do a lot of different things to sort of enhance immune cell function, and also just adding mushrooms to your diet. Again, I think mushrooms is something that not everyone is a big fan of.
Yeah, beta glucans, I think you might find those in oats as well. I can't remember if
they're a different type. So there's sort of 2 different formulations. Most of the research is on the mushroom beta glucans in terms of immune function, anti-cancer properties, antimicrobial properties. And then the beta glucans in oats are similar but different, and seem to be better for things like cardiovascular health, heart disease. So
yeah. Are there particular types of mushrooms that you warm towards perhaps for their benefits or novel antioxidants or anything like that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for just the bog standard button mushroom.
Oh, really?
There's definitely
I thought you were going to say something really exotic there, like maitake or enoki.
Yeah, I think some of the functional mushrooms, the more sort of exotic ones, have some very unique compounds inside that, there's research showing that they're very beneficial. But I think we shouldn't underestimate the bog standard button mushroom.
Yeah. Do you think, because again, I'm basically talking to you about all the supplements that I see in my local health food store. So I'm seeing a lot of dehydrated mushrooms put into capsules of various specificities. So lion's mane, chaga, maitake, a bunch of others. What are your opinions on that? Are you bullish about the idea of those having specific phytochemicals that could be beneficial? And I see immune supporting quite a bit as a claim for those. I'm just wondering what your opinion on those are.
Yeah, I do know. I'm actually quite a fan of the old mushroom supplement.
Yeah.
I do find they're generally quite expensive, which I think could be sort of something that would make people perhaps decide whether they would buy it or not. And I do think there is a growing body of research, but I'm not sure how much is in humans on the various properties of these different mushrooms. I know specific ones seem to be earmarked for their effect on the immune system, but I would suspect that probably the effects are more broad in the body, and there's a lot of overlap between them. So I don't think you necessarily need to just have one type if you're looking for sort of immune supporting mushroom supplement.
If price was no sort of barrier to you or anyone listening to this, let's say, would you take a selection of different mushroom capsules as like, again, almost like a safety belt? Like, I'm not going to get mushrooms in my diet every day. It can be hard to source sometimes. Sometimes I just don't feel like putting mushrooms in my diet.
Yeah.
Would it be beneficial of having like a couple of capsules of a bit of chaga, a bit of lion's mane, maybe,
Yeah.
maitake or whatever? Is that something that you think could potentially have a benefit?
I mean, I would hedge my bets to say yes. It's anyone who follows me on Instagram might have seen me having my eggs in the morning, where I sprinkle mushroom powder on the
Oh,
top
do you?
of them.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I have like just a blend that comes as a powder that you can sprinkle on top and
Awesome.
or put into whatever food, and you wouldn't really taste it. And I think it comes down to it's convenience.
Mm,
So, as a mum who also works, sometimes it's really, there's not enough time to perhaps prepare the food I want. And so
mm,
I have found myself leaning into these kind of powders that you can add to food, some mushroom powders. I also like blueberry powder and have it on
mm.
yogurt because I think blueberries are a real powerhouse, and it's quite tasty as well. So
Yeah.
if I don't have the fresh fruit in, that could also be useful.
Yeah, I've started experimenting with a few powdered ingredients actually, like lingonberry. We
Oh,
did some
yes.
research for the app where we found lingonberries were beneficial for skin health,
Mm-hmm.
probably owing to some of the unique antioxidants, but also its general effect on oxidative stress. So anyway, I started experimenting with that, and it's a very tart sort of tasting berry, which I
Mm.
really like. But then I also have like frozen berries quite a bit, like
Yeah.
black currants. I always like throw that on top of whatever I'm eating, or have it with a dark
Yeah.
chocolate. I'm pretty bullish on the idea of frozen whole foods at source. I think those are really
Yes.
good
Yeah.
convenience.
Yeah, they're a real go-to. Like if I get home and I've got my two hungry kids, that I have my frozen onions, frozen peppers, frozen like different frozen vegetables, and I can quickly make like pasta sauce or something.
Mm,
And I don't need to chop all the veg if I don't have time. So it's kind of striking that balance
mm.
between, what's feasible, and what's available. So they can be really useful. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. On that note, oregano oil. Sorry, I butchered the pronunciation of oregano earlier, and I know people probably want to know a bit more about oregano
Yes.
now.
Yeah, so oregano oils are kind of often considered nature's sort of antibiotic,
Mm,
and there's some evidence that it can work just as effectively. It's also anti-inflammatory, and it seems to be less disruptive to the sort of good bacteria that make up the microbiota on in our bodies. Um, it contains wait, do I pronounce this properly? Carvacrol, and
right.
thymol, which are really powerful antibacterial compounds. And again, you can get this as a supplement, or in sort of a drop form. I think it's perhaps something you should take under the guidance of a practitioner. And then I guess the other antimicrobial is honey, which has been shown to have quite powerful antimicrobial
Mm,
actions, at least in test tubes.
mm.
And it's now deemed a better alternative for coughs and sore throats to taking like the usual stuff you can buy from the pharmacy. And then Manuka honey is the particular type of honey that's really rich in certain antimicrobials, which has a lot
I,
of evidence coming for like wound healing and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I was going to ask about this. So we use a honey topical for wound healing for little wounds on like the
Mm,
face in particular. So I mean, yeah, we have to like keep them under lock and key because they're kind of expensive, and you can't just get like,
yes.
some of the juniors just pick it
Yeah.
up and using it. But I was going to ask, do you invest in Manuka honey? Are you a Manuka honey buyer? Because whenever I go to the supermarket, it's literally like
Oh,
under lock and key in the same way like
yeah.
a bottle of tequila is.
Yeah.
So
It's very
it's
expensive.
expensive. Yeah, it's expensive stuff.
when I grew up, my mum was very much one about like nature heals. She had all these kind of
Okay, yeah.
ideas. And so we always had Manuka honey. And whenever anyone was unwell or anything, it was like straight in Manuka honey. I have to say, I haven't bought it for a number of years.
Uh-huh.
So I have used it in the past with my kids when they were a couple of years younger. It's probably a good one if you can afford it to have in your little kind of medicine cabinet. But yeah, it is prohibitively expensive. And I think
Mm.
that the to get the really good quality ones that are going to have that efficacy, then yeah, you have to pay a mighty price for normally.
Yeah, I haven't been able to justify the cost yet, but I might try. This is going to be an expensive podcast episode for me. I'm going to try out all these different hacks and stuff.
Mhm.
I was going to ask you about N-acetylcysteine as well, because that's something that again we use in medicine
Mhm.
for paracetamol overdoses and stuff. But I was really interested to see its potential use in immunity building.
Yes, yeah. So I'm quite a fan of N-acetylcysteine, so NAC is often shortened to. It's feeding into this pathway of helping us produce glutathione, which is an antioxidant that we produce normally by ourselves. So some antioxidants we get from food, glutathione we produce, but we need to obviously provide the raw materials for our body to do that. NEC has also been shown to interfere with viral replication. And one of the interesting things it does is that it's important for the mucus that our body produces. So lining the mucosa, so the throat, the lungs, the airways, and the digestive tract. And it helps those mucus secretions move more sort of fluidly, and then our body can sort of clear them. And anyone who's ever had a respiratory infection will know that mucus starts to be really problematic and annoying, and you're coughing up mucus. So that's a way of your body getting rid of whatever it is that's infecting you. And 600 milligrams of NEC twice a day has been shown to be beneficial in sort of easing some of those respiratory symptoms that we get when we have this virus and mucosal symptoms. So again, it's another one that's useful to have in your
medicine
little
box.
medicine box.
Yeah. This medicine box is huge. This is great. I mean, I wonder if it's useful in post-viral coughs and post-viral mucus, because that's a very common issue. As a GP, I saw loads of people coming in like 2-3 weeks after having the initial insult, and the fevers have dissipated. They feel much better, but they have this residual sort of mucus, and we usually describe it as a post-viral cough, where you got rid of the virus, but you still got the remnants of what the issue was, which is excess inflammation and mucus. And usually people revert to things like codeine and syrups that don't really have too much evidence behind. So I wonder if that could be beneficial considering the mechanism.
I think so. I would be curious to know what's been looked at in terms of that kind of long tail of infection, and particularly thinking about things like long COVID, purely not only because of its effects on the mucus barrier, but because it's required for the production of glutathione, this antioxidant. And quite often we become very depleted in antioxidants when we're fighting an infection, because we have this rise in oxidative stress from the acts of our immune system producing inflammation. And so perhaps some of its benefits might also come from supporting the antioxidant recovery after infection, which again has been something that's speculated to be underlying things like long COVID, this sort of real depletion of antioxidant status.
Talking of speculation, I've noticed a lot of IV drips with glutathione added to it, as well as some other supplements that are glutathione based. Do you think there's any role for those at all, or again, are we just lacking the evidence base for that?
I'm not familiar with strong evidence in favor of that, but I'd be happy to be corrected, because perhaps it's just something I haven't come across. Again, I think I would probably be a bit cautious before doing something like that. And also, if you get your body to the stage where you need an IV drip, then
Yeah.
you need to work on those foundations as well.
I think this is more of an American thing where they're giving IV
Yeah.
drips as a sort of like extra sort of enhanced
Hmm.
wellness based therapy sort of thing. I'm not too sure how much evidence based there is, but yeah, I think it's definitely something
Yeah.
I'd look into a bit more before trying it myself.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's probably studies looking at glutathione in specific indications,
Mm,
so specific disease situations. But for the general healthy person who's interested in the wellness aspect, they're probably quite healthy anyway.
mm,
Is there a benefit from taking more on top? I'm not sure. And
mm.
I think I would be like a little bit, you know, concerned before sort of parting money on that type of
Yeah,
intervention.
yeah. I think certainly growing up in the UK where we have this concept of, is it going to change management, and is it going to give that stepwise sort of benefit, for the amount of
Hmm.
effort and the potential risk of any intervention? I think, yeah, well, I'm naturally a bit more cautious when it comes to this kind of stuff.
Hmm.
Talking of cautiousness, uh, I wanted to talk about body burden and the
Hmm.
the definition of what we mean by body burden, and the impact of environmental pollutants. You mentioned that before in our sort of framework of how we think about the immune system. And I think, as unfashionable as it is to talk about the impact of chemicals in our environment that we don't have much control over, I think
Hmm.
it's really pertinent for people to understand this idea of like reducing our risk wherever we can, wherever it's feasible
Yeah.
possible, without giving off health anxiety. Because the more you know, the
Yeah.
more you're like, oh my God, I live in London and there's like airplanes going across me, and I'm by a road
Yeah.
and I'm breathing in all these chemicals. So it can be quite stressful, but I think we definitely
Yeah.
need to have these conversations.
Yeah, definitely. And we need to get the messages out in a way that people can not be completely paralyzed by fear, but also perhaps help empower people in sort of different life choices they make, and also with how they cast their votes in terms, because a lot of this I think needs to be coming from legislation and that kind of thing. But
Mm,
body burden is this term used to describe the sort of collective strain in our bodies from all the different exposures we have. And I feel like in biomedical science, we often talk about how the genes load the gun and an environment pulls the trigger, but we don't often step back and think, what is the environment? What does that mean? I mean, it means like everything. And I did a whole chapter about this aspect of our environment on our immune system, because I wanted to really guide people in how they could consider how their environment's making them feel. So yeah, body burden is kind of our exposure to different things that may cause harm. It doesn't necessarily mean that it will cause harm. We see the scary headlines, around BPA as a good example. So bisphenol A is something that's found in certain plastics. There's growing evidence from mice looking at the mechanism of BPA in modulating the hormone responses in the body. And then there's some studies looking in humans that suggest this could be problematic. Now, just because you're exposed to BPA or you've used a BPA water bottle at some point in your life doesn't necessarily mean that this is going to add to your body burden. But then when we start to look in the context of all the other many environmental exposures, it's possible that there's sort of this mounting pile of different things that we come in contact with that might be driving some of the issues that we see with our immune system. And it seems that our immune cells are particularly vulnerable to some of these environmental toxins. I guess
mm.
toxins not perhaps the best word. I guess the man-made manufactured things we officially call toxicants, but toxins is probably a word that people are more familiar with. And
Mm.
most of the studies looking at what's a healthy exposure for a human will be looking at some of these in isolation, but not necessarily looking at your unique suite of exposures over time. And so there's also new chemicals that being put into our food system and our environment all the time that we haven't got any data on. And some of the serious effects might take decades to realize. Pretty much none of us can test ourselves effectively to get an idea of our complete body burden. So just how many of these potentially toxic chemicals have we been exposed to and are inside our body in a way that could be causing harm. And yes, we have ways to detox from many of these, and some of this has been worked out for certain chemicals. So I think BPA, for example, leaves the body quite quickly. I think now it's more looking at that balance of detoxing through urine, stool, liver, sweat, for example, versus exposures. And are we in a stage where the balance is sort of overwhelming in terms of exposures and we can't quite detox quickly enough? And one interesting example that I came out a couple of weeks ago was the detection of microplastics in humans for the first time. So we've found microplastics in urine and stool, but this was the first time that they developed the technology to be able to detect these in the blood of humans. And it seemed that immune cells were like really vulnerable to these and were sucking up these microplastics, and it was altering their function. So it's a very preliminary study, and it doesn't tell us exactly what the implications of this are, but I suspect we're sort of scratching the surface of what our current environment might be doing in terms of a lot of the rising diseases that we see. So metabolic disease, inflammatory disease, autoimmune disease, and allergies. And so I think that we shouldn't be scared or overwhelmed, but we can make choices with what we buy, with how we vote, and with how we support our body's ability to remove some of these toxic products through sort of diet and lifestyle choices that we make.
I'll be honest, that does scare me. I'm trying not to be scared about it, but I know it's a preliminary study, and I know we need to sort of take a pragmatic approach to that, but that is kind of worrying. And I guess, like, considering the way you describe that, so you have your exposure and your environmental exposures collectively that have increased, and our ability to detoxify, which we have some incredible mechanisms innately, are being overwhelmed. What pragmatic choices do you make on a day-to-day basis to reduce said exposure and increase the excretion of those products that I think we have to take a guilty until proven otherwise approach, in my view anyway, because we don't want to wait decades before we have that research to make the changes that we should have done prior.
Yeah, I think I would, just encourage people to be cautious. And also, most of this is linked to planetary health. So reducing the single-use plastic that you use, that's also benefiting our environment. And, the environment is therefore benefiting our health. So the nice thing about it is that if you are motivated and environmentally conscious, then the two are kind of linked together. A lot of exposure, according to the World Health Organization, is attributable to things found in our food. So this can be things that are found naturally in food or generated through cooking methods. So acrylamides, which are when we cook foods with high sugar or starch content. And you get that like browning of the food. And this seems to be linked to increasing the risk of cancer. Then there's the sort of aromatic hydrocarbons. So when you cook meat at very high temperatures, the nitrosamines in processed meat, and then the plastics used in food packaging. Then things like pesticides, herbicides, fungicides that are also in the sort of food chain, and mercury, which is often in seafood. And I don't think we need to avoid certain things, but certainly we can reduce our exposure to single-use plastic. We can make sure that we're eating plentiful plant foods when we are eating some of these foods that have been highlighted, so meats cooked in a certain way, or mercury from seafood, and looking for produce that we're buying that is limiting the number of herbicides and pesticides used in the production. Then again, being inside in our house is actually a huge hazard in terms of the environmental exposure to these things. And this like blew me away when I realized that we're becoming like an indoor species. Like we spend 80% of our time indoors these days. And actually, when I step back and look at my own lifestyle, like a lot of my work is inside. We live in the UK, so the weather for 6 months of the year, you don't want to be outside necessarily. But the air pollution, we normally think about, oh, there's a busy road nearby, there's a lot of air pollution, but actually the air inside our homes can be worse than the air outside our homes. So thinking about indoor air pollution is really important because that's the air that you're breathing most of the time. And it's going to be the accumulation of things like having your windows closed, the byproducts of cooking without good ventilation, certain consumer products. So a lot of the fragrances that are added to things, so maybe in laundry and personal care, cigarette smoke, or certain building materials as well. So those are things that we can also look at by just things like opening our windows more, getting outside as much as possible, choosing products inside our home that minimize some of these things that are known to be problematic. So some of the fragrances, the volatile organic compounds, or what's known as persistent organic pollutants. So these are kind of forever chemicals that hang around for a really long time. And then the phthalates, which is in everything from food packaging, fragrances, different personal care products. And often these accumulate in dust. So it's something that when I was researching the book, I was quite shocked to find that dust is not just kind of this unsightly thing that, you know, accumulates in our home when we haven't got around to cleaning for a while, but it's actually a source of a lot of these environmental toxic chemicals. And so things like wet dusting your home is really, really important to do now and again. Yeah, and just getting your windows open, even when it's cold. Interesting things like upcycling and repurposing furniture, because some of the older furniture hasn't got these sort of gases that come off when it's covered in the flame retardants and things. So using older furniture and upcycling can actually reduce this indoor toxic environment.
That is super interesting. I had no idea about that. It's something called off-gassing.
Off-gassing, yeah. So this is something that happens in the sort of first months when you have sort of a new sofa, that kind of thing. So again, it's good for the environment if you're upcycling. And then cleaning up your cleaning supplies. I think online you can find so many amazing tips for how to make your own cleaning supplies at home. And there's lots of different, more eco-friendly, natural products now becoming available. So, you know, there's even studies looking at people who do cleaning for a living, and their exposure to some of the compounds in the cleaning products can really affect things like lung function and those delicate mucosal barriers, which are such a key part of our immune system defending against what's in our environment. So yeah, there's a lot of different little ways, and I've added some good tips in the book so people can have a look and read a bit more about this. There's also the thing about houseplants and air quality. I've got to ask you about this. So I want to do a quick fire round with you, actually, because I have a bunch of questions that I just thought about this right now. So quick fire round. How many houseplants do you have in your house? Oh, I wouldn't even know where to start. A lot.
Okay, a lot. Is
Yeah.
there a particular plant
40.
that you're like a big 40? Oh my god.
Maybe. I'm quite a fan of a calathea. I'm quite into ferns at the moment. I tend to go with what I find aesthetically pleasing rather than perhaps the ones that are
houseplants sound like they're good. Okay. Do you have plastic or glass Tupperware in your house?
Glass. I switched quite a while ago. Yeah, some of them have plastic lids that make an airtight lid, but obviously the food is not in contact. And save your empty jars from, you know, whenever you've bought things in jars. And then if I'm steaming veggies, I steam extra than what I need. And then I just put them in the glass jar and immediately into the fridge, and they stay really like fresh and don't go too soft and mushy. And then you can add them to a salad the next day, or roast them up with some olive oil or garlic, that kind of thing.
Awesome. This is a quick fire round. So
sorry.
do you use regular perfume, or do you use specific perfumes that are phthalate and fragrance free?
Specific ones that are,
Specific
I
ones,
did a bit of due diligence there.
What house cleaning products do you use? Are we talking Ecova or Method, or are we talking regular cleaning products?
A combination of Ecova, Method, and then a few other things that like I get from my mum, like using vinegar and lemon juice and stuff.
Okay, great. What about I'm just thinking of some other things now. do you use a microwave?
I have a microwave, but it just came with the kitchen. I don't use it that often, actually.
It just came with the kitchen. That's brilliant. Do you sauna?
I built one in my house.
Oh my
because
God,
I love it so much.
I knew it. Okay. This is really fun. I'm just trying to get, it's almost like I'm predicting these things.
Yeah.
I'm a psychic. What else? Do you use barefoot shoes?
Yeah, I have 2 pairs, very well worn.
By the way, this does apply to myself as well. Like I do a lot of these things myself. But I think it's interesting because you start somewhere. It might be a Tupperware. You might be like, I'm gonna remove the plastic ones. I'm gonna start using the glass ones and stuff within reason. Oh, I was gonna ask actually, do you use any non-stick pans?
I do. We have a combination of cast iron, which I feel like I don't have the skill to cook with, or maybe I need to season it better. But I do have ones that one of them were eco brands, but I'm not sure quite what that means in terms of exposure to these sort of environmental chemicals that could be problematic. But sometimes it's a balance. It's not about being perfect. You know 100%. What I mean? Like, it's too exhausting to.
It really is exhausting. So I've got a non-stick pan. It's a big pile of pan that I absolutely love, and I'm not going to get rid of that one. But I did change a bunch of my pans recently. And you're right about the cast iron pans. It does take a little while of getting used to it.
Yeah.
So it's not as easy as just slapping anything in. You need to use slightly more oil. You need to make sure you season the pan after every use.
And that helps with
the sticky.
Yeah.
It's a little bit extra work, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But there are some companies, I'm not affiliated with any of these companies that we mentioned today, but like Le Creuset and Straub, they've got ceramic enameled pans that are less sticky. So you can use those. And the good thing about these is that, yes, they cost twice, sometimes 3 times the price, but they have a lifetime guarantee. And I always hear anecdotes of people like, oh, they broke the handle, they broke one of the knobs, and they sent it back and they just gave it a new one for free. So they're really good in terms of like looking after their customers as well.
And I think the non-stick comes off over time. So then you end up repurchasing a pan, and then that's going in the waste and contributing to the environmental waste. So sometimes investing in 1 or 2 really good things can pay off in the long run.
Absolutely. I wanted to end this conversation actually by talking about stress, and I think it's pretty pertinent actually, because we might have stressed a few people out with all the things that we have to purchase and invest in, like this little cabinet of all these different supplements and stuff. But you talk about stress in the book as sometimes something that we need to reframe as good stress. And I think there's a lot of things that we could learn from Stoicism in terms of the approach and the perspective that we take when it comes to stress, because I think stress inherently in society is seen as a bad thing that you need to mitigate against, you need to sort of protect yourself against. But actually, I think leaning into the stress and reframing how stress is for you and seeing it as something that drives you, motivates you, I think that's a skill that needs to be learned.
I think we need to start talking about stress in a different way, because you know what it's like. It's almost like infectious. If everyone's like, oh, I'm stressed, and it's in a negative light, you start thinking, oh, I must be stressed too. And we know that feeling is having an effect on how your immune system functions, because we know about this close connection between the brain and our thoughts, and the neurochemicals that are orchestrating those thoughts. They're able to affect what our immune cells are doing. Our immune cells have receptors for things like endorphins and dopamine and serotonin. So there's this two-way communication between the brain and the immune system. And I think I've always sort of admitted that I'm a bit of a natural stress head. I get stressed quite easily. So when writing about stress, I was like, this is so illuminating to realize that sometimes I'm stressed because it's motivating me to get somewhere. You know, if you've got an exam, you have a lot of stress in your body, but it's helping you get to that, give you the motivation to do the revision. Or even with COVID, there's stress around this new virus in the beginning of the pandemic. It's motivating people to maybe be a bit more vigilant about the basic tenets of public health that we know stop infections from spreading, that may have got sort of diluted along the years. And so it's powerful, and it's very real. It's just hard to think of it in a physical sense, because we often associate stress with how we're feeling in our mind. But no matter what is stressing you out, whether it's work or life or any other aspect that's causing stress on your body, we have this one single stress response, which is orchestrated by epinephrine, norepinephrine, and cortisol. And actually, a short-term stress is very good for your immune response, because it's getting your body ready to fight off infection, to heal a potential wound. You know, imagine if you're about to be hit by a bus, you need that stress response to get you to safety. And if you were accidentally hit by the bus, you need your immune system there to start healing and repairing you. But it's when that cycle goes on that it starts to become negative. It becomes distress. So the opposite would be eustress, a beneficial stress. And somebody who gets stressed quite easily, I was really curious in what I could do to figure this out. And I break this down in the book, because we see a lot of different stress tools. And again, often it's really overly simplified. And I'd be like, I can't meditate when I'm like in the supermarket and I just get this phone call about something really stressful. There's nothing I can do in that moment around mindfulness and meditation and all these things that have evidence-based stress reducing practices. But what I can do is I can probably access my breath, and I can probably access my eyes and take myself into a better environment. So going out into green space is very calming. Broadening the gaze, because when we're stressed, we tend to hyperfocus, and also accessing our breathing. So you can take conscious control over your breathing, and you can practice something like box breathing or extending the exhale. And it's all giving signals to your brain that you're safe, it's calm, it's okay, and that can help bring down that sort of stress response. So I see these as sort of the real-time tools that we can use in real time when we're stressed. And then there's the kind of future-proofing tools that take a bit of skill and practice. So the meditation, you know, you might need to get some help on how to meditate, or join a class, or look at some resources and practice it. It's not going to maybe help you with stress right here, right now, but it might future-proof you from other stresses that are still to come, because it's sort of an inevitable part of life. And then there's this sort of stress where you physically or deliberately put yourself into a stressful situation. So getting in an ice bath is going to have that same stress chemistry going around your body, but it's going to help you sort of raise your threshold for stress. It's sort of going to help. It's a hormetic stress, as we call it. So it's deliberately stressing your body to help make you more resilient to that stress chemistry in the future. And we know that the stress chemistry helps your immune system in the short term, as I mentioned, but over time it will suppress your immune function. And I think one of the biggest things that's overlooked when people think about their immune system is the effect of stress on their body. We become so sort of habitualized to how stressed we are that it's almost normal to just feel stressed 24/7 about work, about deadlines, about never really being off anymore, because everything's quite 24/7. I think blurring the lines when everyone moved to remote working. And I think leaning into that is really, really important. I remember when I was writing the book, and I was just thinking, writer's block is just like writing. it's just hard. And once you kind of accept that and sort of lean into that, you're like, that's why it feels so hard, because it just is hard, but it's something I want to do so I can push through that. And the same comes from my thoughts about parenting. Like, it's just hard sometimes, but that is just parenting, you know, and then lean into it and start thinking about why you're doing it, and looking for the positives. It can be a good way to take the edge off. And I think if you do struggle with stress, you have to work twice as hard maybe to empty that stress cup. So I kind of think of us all as having a different size of stress cup. So if mine is quite small, it gets full really quickly. I've got to do little things all the time to relieve my stress. Whereas somebody who's got a greater capacity for stress, maybe they don't need to work as hard on that kind of easing off of the stress in your life.
I love that analogy. That's brilliant. Like finding out what size stress cup you are. So you know how often you need to empty said cup. And it might be like once a day, it might be once a week. You know, for me, meditation every day is like a habit that I need to maintain. But it's interesting the way you talk about it in terms of how some people use meditation in the moment, whereas actually it should be used as a preventative tool in the same way we might use a statin, or we might use exercise to prevent, you know, cardiovascular issues in the future. And in the moment, those breathing tools, those eyes tools, you know, labeling the issue and being aware and being intuitive of the stressful moment, and then doing some little actions and having that little stress toolbox so you can mitigate the effects of it. I think those are things I'm going to start practicing now. Widening my gaze is definitely something I need to start doing more of, because I'm just sat in front of a computer the whole time these days. So,
and I think, you know, like, we shouldn't underestimate the trickle down effect of being stressed. So yes, we know that distress or unhelpful stress can suppress our immune system, but it can also affect our sleep. Cortisol is also pulling sugar into our bloodstream, and that can mess with our blood sugar regulation, which can mess with the food that we're more likely to reach for. And then if we're sleep deprived, there's now evidence that we end up reaching for the wrong foods and over consuming calories, and then that affects your immune system. So it's kind of, if you manage to keep on top of that stress and have those tools in your toolbox, then the sort of broader implications are really, really huge. And I often think people are desperately trying to eat well. You have to go upstream and look at things like stress before you can get yourself in a headspace where you've got that capacity to make those food choices that are going to support your health. And then the more I think about it, I think, well, so much about our mental health is important for our physical health. So if you have a good mental state, you recover better from things, from operations, from infections. But so much of our physical health, like eating well and exercise, is supporting our mental health. And these two, you just can't overestimate how these two things are linked, I think.
Yeah. Jenna, this is so lovely chatting to you for this amount of time. We've done a few pods before. We talked about inflammation and the immune system itself, and it's always a pleasure to have you on. And you've done an amazing book, and I can't wait to see what happens next for you. And your newsletter is great as well. I'm a subscriber. It's a great resource.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I can't believe I've managed to consistently keep it up now for a couple of years. I really enjoy it, actually. It's nice to have a little sandbox for ideas.
And you're superwoman. Proper superwoman.